Thank you, Count Corla. Let me open up by emphasising Ireland's absolute respect for international law, our view that this is at the core of our foreign policy, and emphasising our track record in what we have done and what we have called for on behalf of the people of Gaza. So let me open up again by making the government's stance really clear. We condemn Israel's illegal annexation of the occupied Palestine territories, and we condemn the catastrophic humanitarian situation arising from Israel's war in Gaza. That is why we have taken an active role in the preparations and conduct of the forthcoming UN high-level conference on implementing the two-state solution. It's why we have pushed for action at an EU level. It's why we've welcomed the announcement that the EU will conduct a review of the association agreement with Israel. This is a step that Ireland and Spain first called for in February 2024. This is an important decision taken through diplomacy, taken in no small part due to Ireland making the case for international law and our recognition of the suffering of the people of Gaza. But in contrast to the interventions that we have made in a collective way with many other countries, the bill today represents a unilateral effort to attempt to curtail the ability of Israel to raise financing on the international markets. Let me explain why this bill does not do that. Let me explain why the government is opposing it. I want to open up by noting that the bonds that we refer to are not listed on the Irish Stock Exchange. They are in fact not listed in any EU stock exchange. They're targeted at retail investors who purchase the bonds through promoters who are based in London, Paris and Frankfurt. Now, the legislation that's before us, which I note, while the opposition made many general points, many of which I do agree with in terms of the suffering, the harm, the awful violence that the people of Gaza are now enduring, the speeches were noticeably absent on detail regarding the bill, which I'm going to turn to. But on that point of detail and precision, it is important that we are precise in our language. So let's be clear on the role of the central bank. It does not sell or it does not oversee the sale of Israeli bonds. The Central Bank of Ireland does not sell these bonds. This evening, I've heard the opposition refer to the central bank trading them, selling them, dealing them, or bonds being sold through the central bank. That does not happen. The central bank's sole role is to assess the bond prospectus that is in front of us, to ensure that it includes all the requirements it is meant to under the EU regulation in this area. Neither the issuer, in this case the State of Israel, nor the financial products, in this case the government bonds, become regulated or endorsed as a result of this assessment. So they are the facts. If I move on to the bill and deal with some issues in relation to it, and I'll go through it section by section, which didn't happen in any speech that was made here this evening. So section 4 sets out restrictive measures that may be taken. Now, it's important to note that many sections of that will not prevent the central bank from carrying out its role under the prospectus regulation. Section 4C seeks to provide a means of restricting or prohibiting the central bank from fulfilling its obligations under the regulation I referenced. However, by seeking to permit the central bank to step outside the financial services legislation in the area, I'm advised that these measures would be judged to be inconsistent with EU law and therefore subject to legal challenge. And I hope the Dáil can appreciate this evening that any attempts by the government to introduce measures outside the agreed legal framework in the area pose a significant policy risk. Now, for the first time in the state, what this bill aims to do is to introduce a national sanctions regime. But then again, let's step back, let's acknowledge the huge suffering that is at the cause of this debate, but look also at how Irish diplomacy has worked. And how it has worked is that the sanctions that we have implemented have been ones that have been negotiated, agreed and introduced at EU and UN level. They are an important tool to promote the objectives of the EU's common foreign and security policy. Sanctions are stronger, they're more effective when done collectively. Rather than be seen to do something, it's far better to ensure the outcome is effective. And furthermore, the clear advice that has been provided to me, it's not about being hiding behind the law. It's as a government and as a member of Parliament being subject to the law. The article is very clear that the bill conflicts with Article 215 of the Treaty of the European Union, which is intended to preclude individual member states from issuing their own restrictive measures, which could undermine the integrity of how the EU conducts its external affairs policies. And the reason for that, again, is the EU has shown its ability to make progress when it acts in a collective way. And then finally, statements that have been made in particular by Deputy Doherty indicate that the bill, and what I'm doing is going through the bill, which didn't happen in the earlier statements from Sinn Féin, it indicates that the bill is intended to prevent the sale of Israeli bonds throughout the European Union. However, we cannot promote, or indeed propose, national legislation that prohibits the sale of something at EU level. Any actions taken by Ireland have to recognise the distinction between policy areas at a national level and those at an EU level. And the reality is that even if this bill were to be enacted, Israeli bonds would still be available to retail investors across the EU and further afield. Let me repeat that. Even if this bill were to be enacted, Israeli bonds would still be available to retail investors across the EU and further afield. And the government does not support enacting legislation that is ineffective. Finally, the private member's motion, the advice again that I've received, is that it is, for the reasons that I've outlined, it's in conflict with the treaties of the European Union and our obligations as a member state, and it doesn't materially impact on the ability of Israel to raise money by selling bonds. If our goal is to uphold the international rule of law, then we must be sure not to violate it. And let me conclude on that point. What we have done as a government is made very clear our condemnation of what is happening to the people of Israel. We have been at the forefront of the diplomatic activity within the EU to do this, at the forefront of our role with regard to the International Criminal Court, with our support for UNRWA, with making the case for change with regard to the EU-Israel trade agreement. And the images that I know are a reality for so many, but are being used shamefully here in a way to make political points. What they cannot do, what they cannot do, Count Corlett, is afford a distraction from the detail of a bill that isn't able to deliver the claims that have been made against it, and is asking the Bill and asking the Dáil to support a measure that we as a government believe and have been advised is ineffective. Tomorrow will mark the anniversary of Ireland's recognition of the State of Palestine. It will mark a year and a further year in which the government has taken the steps it can to aid the people of Gaza. But what I will not do is make a commitment here this evening in relation to legislation which I believe will not work, isn't consistent with our law, and won't help the people of Gaza.
Thank you. Deputy Cronin.
Disgraceful speech.
The gallery must be silent.
Listen to the genocide. Do your job, man. Do your job.
Hear, hear.
Which is an institution of the people, not the government.
Deputy Cronin? Do we have Deputy Cronin? Deputy Cronin? No?
I think she